Hi, I'm Jonathan Dean, Seattle Opera dramaturg. Every opera season, we like to present at least one show which we've never given before, either a new work like Charlie Parker's Yardbird or The Revolution of Steve Jobs, or an older opera like Katya Kabonova or Maria Stuarda. For the 2020-2021 season, we were so excited a year ago, January, to announce that we'd finally be presenting Flight, with music by Jonathan Dove to a libretto by April DeAngelis. This modern masterpiece premiered in 1998, and we've been trying to organize a Seattle Opera production for what feels like decades. And then, last March, well, you know what happened. But actually, it's worked out okay in this case because we are giving you Flight this season, an opera all about being stuck, about people trapped in one place because of circumstances beyond their control. We're delivering the opera in a way none of us could possibly have foreseen, but one I hope you'll find intriguing and innovative. In this pre-show video, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the opera, avoiding spoilers, and to give you some things to listen and watch for. I really do believe Flight is a masterpiece, well worth the careful consideration you'd give to any opera we present on the main stage. It was premiered in 1998 at Glyndebourne, one of the world's greatest opera companies. Glyndebourne's then general director, Anthony Whitworth-Jones, asked the composer, Jonathan Dove, for a Marriage of Figaro for the 1990s. And in a way, I think that's what Dove and DeAngelis created. Like The Marriage of Figaro, Flight is a high comedy concerning several different loving couples with various relationship issues. The love stories are timeless. But just as The Marriage of Figaro was also about the 1780s and 90s, that age of revolution, so Flight is also about some of the big issues of the late 20th century, and not much has changed since then. It works a little bit like a fairy tale. You know how in a fairy tale the characters have job descriptions instead of names? How it's the baker, the Beauty and the Beast, and the Baba Yaga. In Flight, even though most of the characters have names on the cast page, most of them are listed by job title or function. The controller, the refugee, the older woman, the Minsk man. That keeps the show properly theatrical, one step off reality. Even though we're offering you a movie this year, Flight was designed as a theater piece. Now, the characters. There are 3 couples plus a few single people. The vocal casting should help you tell everyone apart. The soprano and tenor are a couple, and the mezzo is with the baritone. Then there's another mezzo-baritone pair, the Minsk man and Minsk woman. They're a married couple expecting a child, and since they're a little older, their singing requires a bit more oomph. Then there's a character called the older woman. She's extremely single. She's sung by a mezzo or contralto with a rich lower range. Her range actually overlaps with that of a male character, the refugee, who's sung by a countertenor. That's a male singer who's trained his falsetto range, excuse me, so he can sing beautifully in the treble clef. As I say, all these characters are fictional, like fairy tale archetypes. But the refugee's story was inspired by something that happened to a real-life person, Mehran Karimi Nasseri, a native of Iran who ended up spending 18 years living in Charles de Gaulle Airport outside Paris. The specifics of Nasseri's situation don't make it into the opera. The opera certainly isn't about that individual. But we have in this refugee a fascinating character, a stateless person in search of sanctuary who needs help from people who don't particularly feel responsible for him. 2 more characters who work in the airport. At the extremes of vocal range, the controller is a very high soprano, a Queen of the Night type voice, whereas the immigration officer is a low bass, kind of a Zarastro sound. Composer Jonathan Dove gives him a terrifying musical motif in a powerfully mechanical 11/8 time signature with the musical marking inexorable. If the immigration officer is rooted deeply in the earth, his opposite, the controller, is always soaring way up aloft in the highest regions of voice. Flight is set at an airport terminal, but this is not Verismo or kitchen sink reality. With music like that, don't you feel like floating way up in the troposphere? The magic of opera is how the music tells the story, how the music creates a mental or emotional reality for the characters. Our maestro for this production, Viswa Subbaraman, agrees with me that it's the storytelling power of Jonathan Dove's music that's so extraordinary. He discussed the opera with me after the music was recorded, but while they were still finishing the film. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very excited to get to introduce to you Maestro Viswa Subbaraman, who's normally I would be doing this in person at Techni Jones Hall or at McCaw Hall, but here we are, of course, on Zoom, as you all recognize. Maestro, welcome to Seattle Opera.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm excited.
It's a fantastic piece of music, and what a vivid musical world Jonathan Dove creates. How does he do that musically?
I think one of the biggest geniuses of like the genius to the work is really the color he produces with the orchestra. His orchestration is, I mean, I thought incredibly brilliant. And we did the reduced orchestration due to the COVID restrictions, et cetera. But even then, the amount of color he can create with the vast amount of percussion, we had everything from glockenspiel to, vibraphone to, so like everything in the kitchen sink was in the percussion section.
And then keyboards as well. I don't know if
And
you consider keyboard instruments members of the percussion section.
and harp, right? So you've got keyboard, harp, and quite a hefty harp part. But also like his use of like other extra techniques. So for example, you had a lot of like use of like glissandi harmonics, so like in the strings, instead of playing like a true tone, they're playing a harmonic tone, right? To give you this kind of shimmery effect, which, Stravinsky used and Bartok used, but, he used that as well.
Now, curiously, we also have, in addition to those harmonics in the string section, we have in the Refugee a countertenor who's
Right.
doesn't have strings, but there's a similar kind of effect that creates that sound, isn't it?
It is, and that kind of that highly developed falsetto that men can sing with when you are a countertenor is it's a very haunting kind of sound, right? In that same way, because there's such a clarity to it, and such almost like a trumpet like clarion sound to a countertenor. Right?
Our countertenor Randall Scotting does these, as you're talking about those glissandos. There's several of them where he sort of hits one pitch and then drizzles off of it, or kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think his opening line even, excuse me, and he kind of like he scoops these glissandi up, and a lot of that technique gives you such a sense of color and a sense of detail that you probably wouldn't get had he not you deployed those, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it never feels gimmicky, which is I think a great strength of his scoring. Too often people use these extra musical, which is not a great term, but these extra traditional techniques, and often I feel like it just is used because the composer thought it was a cool sound. Whereas in this piece, I feel like they were really used to create and evoke some storytelling. So that
Tell me about one of my favorite moments it's in the third act in the Refugee's narrative when he's talking about being hiding in the wheel wells as he's sort of a stowaway in this airplane, and he just sings the word "the cold," and there's this very weird. I would just describe it without knowing the musical technological terms as icy kind of effect.
Yeah, there's a very icy, no non-vibrato. Again, strings move to to harmonics in order to create this kind of floating stillness in that sound. It's actually it's one of my favorite chords in the piece. It comes out of nowhere because because he has it happen right on the downbeat as he hits that last note. And then when the singers when Randall was done singing, you just have that little shimmer of that note like hanging in the air afterwards. And you're right, it's evocative of that
It's
idea of cold.
really, I mean, puts you there in that experience, which, hopefully none of us will ever have to experience
It,
anything like that.
it's haunting in the way he
You know.
pulled it off.
Now, tell me about these time signatures as well, because wow, for a straightforward and pretty much tonal work, it gets. You mentioned Stravinsky a minute ago. How do you prepare to conduct something which is going in and out of all these weird 11/8 when the immigration officer keeps coming by with this sort of terrifying? Dur, 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 dur.
Right. So much of it, like I felt like I lived with my metronome for months preparing for this. At one point, I think my metronome app was my most used app on my phone. Um, and you walk around counting. I would go for a walk in, because the beauty of Houston in January, you can go for a walk and it's nice out. And I'm the weird guy going, like walking down the street because you have to get it to sink in. And I think the additional challenge, I think for all of us, which was also a joy, most of us hadn't worked in a year, you
Mm.
know. So not only are we coming back to do this like intensely metered, you know, rhythmic score, it's been a while since we'd all have to do that in the room together. So I think from that perspective, like trying to really get that prepared, really get that rhythm in, and it's really about the metronome. I mean, I
Mm.
spend a lot of time with my metronome because I feel like if you don't have that sense of rhythm, then the piece can't have structure.
Hmm. What about those? I mean, you mentioned the size of the orchestration. I mean, even in a reduced orchestration, this epic scope of the instrumentation. You also have these epic ensembles. I mean, where opera goers were sort of used to ensembles, trios, quartets, maybe a sextet if it's a big Donizetti bel canto thing. But 9 people all just going full tilt. How do you prepare? How do you get your ears to even know if you're doing it correctly?
You again build it from the ground up, and so for a lot of it for me was just kind of singing each line to where I could hear each line separately, and then kind of building it layered in my head.
Hmm.
And then the other side is we have the luck of knowing kind of the harmonic shifts per measure and knowing like when someone's a little off, you're going to hear it. And then trusting the great singers we had. I mean, that's the other part that really was huge. Our setup for recording this was amazing, right? In the sense that because of COVID, we had the orchestra taking up the entirety of the stage, and the singers were in the hall. They were in
We
Benaroya
should
Hall
explain
behind
to
me.
our viewers who might not know this that the soundtrack they're listening to was actually recorded at Benaroya, not at any Seattle Opera facility, but the home of the Seattle Symphony.
Right, and so you had the singers literally in the audience seats, um, behind me, 15 feet apart, in order to like again because we were trying to make sure everyone stayed safe and healthy during the time this COVID period. And so from that setup, I was thankful that I had so many great ears in the room as well. The Phil, the assistant conductor at Seattle Opera, so many people were in the room to kind of help because with the distances, which with some of those issues, it became more of a team effort than perhaps it would be otherwise.
And you had rehearsed with all of the singers with piano in a small room before going into the bigger Benaroya space with the orchestra, right? But how many times through did you actually record? I mean, I can't imagine that you guys just did it once and got it perfect.
Almost, that's a great question. We recorded over 3 days. Um, and again, this was it was fascinating. Each orchestra call was 3 hours, but we lost about 45 minutes total in breaks because they had to make sure the air cleared out and we had air like complete circulation. So we're really talking about 2 hours and 15-ish minutes per call, so about 6 hours to record the whole opera. And so a lot of it was done very much on one take. Proportions of it, absolutely. And then what we were able to do is like, so day one, we recorded most of Act One and part of Act Two. That evening, Rob, the sound engineer, and and Phil, we sat there with headphones on and went through the entirety of that day's takes, figured out which sections needed to be re-recorded, and then started building a list of priorities. And day two,
Mhm.
we finished Act Two, got into Act Three. Day three, we finished Act Three, and then we started our retakes.
Mhm. So,
And
so it sounds like the scheduling of that and knowing how to run a normal orchestra rehearsal, which half of that is being a really good use of time. knowing the parts that you're going to have to spend a lot of time to rehearse and the parts that you can sort of, oh, they'll figure this one out.
Well, yeah, and I think that's one of my conducting teachers used to say that the best you'll ever be is the day before you die. It's that learning of experience, and I look back to when I first started conducting, and there were probably things I stopped for all the time that now, you can glance at an instrumentalist or like a singer, and they'll look at you and be like, yeah, okay, we both know that it wasn't right, so I don't need to go back, I don't need to stop the group, we're all on the same page, you'll fix it next time. You develop that trust, and the musicians develop that trust with you as well. And that again is like, it's a lot about experience, and with this, it was having to do that in a recording situation as well. So I think we were incredibly lucky. I mean, the singers were amazing, and the orchestra played so beautifully that my job was made a lot easier that way.
Do you have a particularly favorite moment in the opera, or are there spots that this is the experience I always have listening to Benjamin Britten as I'm getting to know a Britten opera. There come these moments, and every night I like, oh, it's coming, and oh, here we are. And I don't know if this works in a similar way.
I'm a softie. I'm not gonna lie. One of my favorite moments is when the Minx Man returns, and he tells his wife that he realized how much he loved her.
I mean, it's hard for him to get the words out, but
I think it's kind of,
that's just the character.
I think it's so clever, right? Well, I mean, I think he's supposed to be emotionally distant, and that's the one moment where he finally realizes the importance of their relationship. But the climax in that moment is just gorgeous, and it's
interesting.
So
Yeah, no, that's
written.
It's a great turning point.
The way he uses the brass in that section, there's almost like a Mahler-like quality of how the brass pushes the singer over the top. So one of my favorite moments in the piece.
Cool. Thanks, Maestro Subbaraman. I'm sure everyone in our audience will relish getting to know this opera and finding all our favorite spots. Before I wrap up, I want to tell you a little about how What You'll See was created. The music was recorded at Benaroya Hall, and then our cast and crew went to the Museum of Flight, who were terrific partners with us on this production, providing locations for filming that came complete with airplanes. Director Brian Stauffenbiel has been specializing in contemporary opera with the San Francisco-based company Opera Parallel, and we were planning on bringing their production of Flight to Seattle. He was suddenly challenged to make a movie instead of a theatrical production, and worked creatively with cinematographer Kyle Seago to storyboard, film, and then edit the opera. At Seattle Opera this season, we've learned a lot about making movies. Flight was filmed at the Museum of Flight down by Boeing Field, both inside and also outside the museum for some shots. They filmed night scenes. They shot with steam and mud, and one of the really great theatrical lighting designers, Dwayne Schuler, learned how to light for cameras. The backpack contraption in this photo keeps the camera steady while the cameraman moves through the playing space for a dynamic shot. At the museum, the singers were lip-syncing to the playback of themselves singing the week before at Benaroya with the orchestra, a new experience for many performers whose work you've enjoyed before on our main stage. I'm pleased to announce the Seattle Opera debut of Charlene Joint, our high soprano who plays the controller. If you're a Seattle Opera regular, you'll recognize the other cast members. They include, in order of vocal appearance, Randall Scotting as the refugee, Joshua Cole as Bill, and Karen Vuong as Tina, Margaret Gvershak as the older woman, Sarah Larson as the stewardess and Joseph Latanzi as the steward, Aubrey Alicock as the Minsk man and Karen Mushagian as the Minsk woman, and Damien Jeter as the immigration officer. I'm very excited about Flight, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for your continuing support of Seattle Opera.